Friends, what does racial justice have to do with creation justice? Everything. Welcome to the ecoChristian podcast, where we're exploring what it means to be Christian on planet Earth. I'm your host, Caleb Cray-Haynes. Today, we're having a special episode because I'm joined by three amazing leaders in the church and the creation justice movement to have a dialogue on this great topic here that we've talked on at different points, but we're really digging a little deeper in this episode. But real quick, I wanted to remind you about the new Creation Justice Ministries annual resource that just recently came out. I'm super proud to have been involved in its creation with such a great group of thinkers. It's called The Power of God: From Extractive Theology to Transformative Faith. And this is the 2025 resource out of CJM that it offers theological framing, sermon starters, songs, liturgy. I mean, so many good things. Small group questions, and there's some really great action items in there as well. All of this to help engage your church in this work we're talking about right here in this podcast. And it's a free download. It's a free resource. It's all online and it's all in the show notes. So click it. You won't regret it. So good. Also, I've got to throw this in today because it's what I've been working on with some people, and we just opened registration for it, and it's we're calling it Creation Care Summit 2.0, and this is a Creation Care conference hosted by the organization that I direct, Nazarenes for Creation Care. But whether you're part of the Church of the Nazarene or not, this will be a great time, and you're welcome to join us. I think that's going to be a really fruitful time together this October in Kansas City. So I'm linking that as well, just because. Okay, friends, we've got so much to get to here, so without further ado. Okay, greetings, friends. I'm so thankful to be here today in the virtual room with some really wonderful people, and it's really just such a privilege to gather together. So this is a group of wonderful people who I was very privileged to be a part of a panel with back in October with the National Council of Churches, where we talked about racial justice and creation justice and the intersections therein. So sitting here, quote unquote, with me is Reverend Dr. Leslie Copeland-Tune, who is the Senior Associate General Secretary and Advocacy Director at the National Council of Churches in the USA. So good. Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Yes. And I'm with Reverend Jenny Phillips, who's the Director of Environmental Sustainability she's with the General Board of Global Ministries in the United Methodist Church. So welcome, Jenny.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yes. And last but not least, Reverend Monique Crain Spells, Vice President for Mission, Advocacy and Programs, and Director of Christian Education Faith Formation with Disciples Home Missions. Is that right?
That's correct. Thank you.
So good. Yes. So, yeah, just to get a little bit more of context for our listeners, maybe we can go then in backwards order and start with you, Monique, if you just want to share like 60 seconds or however long really of this is more of who I am, and this is kind of my work in the world.
Well, who I am today, my work in the world today. Here at Disciples on Missions, we have a number of missional programs that have the organization is 175 years old, and so when the church, the denomination of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ started, it was the United Christian Missionary Society. And as that society grew and its funds grew, and they were doing overseas work and stateside work, and mission centers were being established across the country for a number of things, immigration, early childhood education, feeding unhoused people, literacy, all kinds of things. They decided to break that up into Disciples Overseas Ministries, which, is part of the Global Ministries organization of the UCC and the DOC. And then disciples home missions, and we would just do stateside mission things inside the United States and Canada. And so we are the beginning, the oldest part of the church. And at Disciples Home Missions, we have, which brought me to this conversation, we have a program area called Green Chalice, which handles all of our creation care, justice work in the U.S. and Canada. Um, Part of that team has also been a part of Creation Justice Ministries, and we used to be the fiscal agent for Creation Justice Ministries here. So we have that entity in addition to, of course, Children and Families Ministries, Youth and Young Adult Ministries, Immigration Refugee Council System, and DHM, as well as the Search and Call Ministerial Profile System of the church, and many other things, Christian education of the church. But what I have tried to do in my role over the last couple of years is to function from an intersectional gospel. And that's a language that I've started to use in the space of our ministry, which had not been used, I don't know, anywhere, but that's how I've tried to get us to understand our work. Not just that we function in intersectionality, but that the gospel is intersectional. And if we are teaching it well, and if we're teaching it in its fullness from whatever our program areas are, we're not building these little kingdoms where I'm an expert on everything, but we're teaching that everything touches everything when we're living into the gospel, when we understand it intersectionally, and when we understand Jesus as an intersectional leader of our faith. So in my work with the Creation Justice Ministry of Green Chalice, one of the things that started before I was even in the vice presidency, when I was more of a peer ministry, was saying, okay, what I don't know enough about this, and this was 4 years ago, and in that conversation with them, their response was, and we don't know enough about faith formation in different contexts. Primarily, most of their constituents were white. Period. And so, to wrap up my 60 seconds, there can be a presumption that simply because Black and brown people are not at a table, that they are not inherently tied to what's being discussed at the table. And the reality is, Black and brown people, in particular my ancestors, were abducted and brought here explicitly because of our relationship with land. Explicitly, because we did not separate God from tree, or God from water, or God from fire, or God from air, or God from earth. And because we never made those distinctions, we became, of course, excellent in how to attend to those things. And so that the fact that we're not at those tables now is not related to our inherent appreciation and knowledge of ancestral knowledge of creation, but because of a breach that happened between our community and creation. And so that's kind of the perspective that informs the connective tissues that we're trying to build across all the ministries that happen at Disciples Home Mission, from one program area to the other.
Thank you so much for that. We're already going places. I'm like really tempted just to whoo. Yeah. So that's love that. Yeah, Jenny, give us a minute about who Jenny Phillips is and what you're up to.
Yeah, I am a pastor in the United Methodist Church, serving in what we call extension ministry. So rather than at a local church, serving our mission agency, Global Ministries, we're the mission and humanitarian aid agency of the United Methodist Church. It includes UMCOR, the United Methodist Committee on Relief, which focuses on disaster response and recovery and migration. The ministries of Global Ministries also include global health, agriculture, missionary services. And in all of those things have a connection to the environment. And so my role as Director of Environmental Sustainability is twofold. One is to look internally at the work of the agency and look for ways where it's clear we need to make our work sustainable. When we're out there doing disaster response, for example, and we're using gas generators to power the equipment that we're responding to disaster with, there was a time when that was the best we could do, but even as we were doing it, we were sowing the seeds for future disaster. So now one of the initiatives I work on is integrating solar into disaster response. Turns out it's great because it's quiet, doesn't stink. You can generate power from the sun day after day. You don't have to pick up more gas. And so I'm the person in our agency who's looking at different ways that we can say, how have we done it in the past, and how can we make it better and more sustainable and actually good for the folks with whom we work. And I'm working both in the U.S. and globally. In addition, I work with congregations and annual conferences, which are regional bodies, on various sustainability initiatives. The one that brings me here is our Global Ministries Earthkeepers program, where we equip United Methodists to launch environmental projects in their communities. When I first joined the agency, this was one of my primary work areas, and I saw that most of the people, the vast, vast majority of the people participating in the program were white people. And they were white people who, many of them had read a lot of really good books about anti-racism. They understood that there's a connection between race and the impacts of climate. And there was a gap. Okay, so we know all this information. We agree with it. We want justice, but how do we seek justice, and how do we do justice? And what does that have to do with the actual project I'm planning during this training? And it's made me realize there's a real gap in the church in general of, like, how do you actually change things? Not just know the problem, but take ownership, if you're a white person, for helping change the problem.
Thank you. Yeah. Leslie, who's Reverend Dr. Leslie Copeland-Tune, and what are you up to in the world a little bit?
Wow, after those introductions.
I know. What are you gonna do after that? But
So I work for the National Council of Churches of Christ in the USA. We have 37 member denominations. This is our 75th year. So there were organizations that preceded NCC way as far back as 1908, but since this configuration has been since 1950. So I am working on a number of justice issues, including environment. My background, I worked at NCC in the early 2000s as the Washington Communication Officer. And right before that, I was the outreach coordinator for the National Religious Partnership for the Environment, which NCC is one of the members of. And now I serve as the chair of that. NRPE is what we call it, National Religious Partnership for the Environment. And so this is an issue that is a passion area for me. I think it's so hard for us to, um, environment, air doesn't know racism, right? So water doesn't say, okay, I'm going to stop being polluted once I hit this community or that community. And I think so often, from my just social location as a Black woman, we are left out of these conversations. Many times I am one of few at the table, and when these issues are being discussed, and yet I know the impacts that it has on my community and all of us. I mean, you have Black children with higher asthma rates. The statistics just go on and on and on. You think about the places where water, my goodness, water in America, there are places like Baltimore, like Flint, Michigan, that still is struggling with having clean water to drink, and the impacts of what the lead pipes have done to that community. You have places in Mississippi and other places in I'm in the DC areas, places in Southeast DC and other places that we should be able to fix this, right? And um, yeah, I'll say more about some of the impacts of even the dismantling of the environmental justice department at the Environmental Protection Agency that has happened since January 20th.
Mm.
And it's some of it is honestly a little heartbreaking because you feel like the statistics of it, like there's so much that we already know about how to address these issues, about how to mitigate harm. And yet there are people who are determined to allow harm to happen without almost callously. And that the heartbreaking part is that, well, there are a lot of heartbreaking parts, but one of the heartbreaking things for me is that it's not going to take long for us in the whole scheme of things to realize the error of some of these decisions that are being made and some of the ways that they are being carried out. And unfortunately, the harm for some people, it will be too late. And so, we come to this moment. It's such a great time to have this conversation. But there's definitely some urgency that behind this that wasn't there in October even. And so, but it also gives us an opportunity to be who I think God calls us to be as the church, to be the church, not just do church activities, and to really speak up for all of God's creation. It just seems so um, counterintuitive to not do it, that it's sometimes hard for us who have been doing this work. Like, what is like, how do you not see it? But everybody is on their own journey, and I think we have the responsibility of helping to move people along at this point.
That's really good. I kind of want to stay in this space a little bit, but maybe before we jump into more ecclesial responses, we just spend a minute and chat more broadly about if and hopefully everyone has done some critical work here, but if someone's listening and this is their first time really thinking about these intersections more meaningfully here, how creation and racial justice are woven together. Wondering if anyone wanted to jump in on how you've seen racial justice work over time rise up more to demand creation justice. Now, of course, they've always been interconnected, but we haven't done the faithful work, I don't think, of connecting these things very, very well more until recently.
Well, I think, well, in my particular case, I was working at the seminary um, when a lot of conversation was happening in response to Katrina. And so when Katrina happened, the intersection of creation care and racial justice exploded live on television for the world to see. When you see, um, Black folks standing on roofs for days at a time, when you see a Superdome, um, filled with, um,
Mm.
hell,
Yeah.
okay, hell on earth, and all manner of tragedies happening in that space, and just days and days and days of disparity in the country. It's not a third world country now. In this country, and when the levees broke, the colliding of these realities to me could not be denied by anyone. And I think for those who had some awareness of what climate change and creation care, creation justice, how it impacts the poorest and the brownest in the world, then there became this very massive, tragic illustration, embodiment of the collision that gave many the platform for a much more robust conversation in their communities that may have never had that conversation. And I know that's one of the things that was happening in the seminary, in particular with some of my white students, where um, they were able, the intersection came to them in a way that it had not come before. They had been very much involved in climate change conversations, but the intersection became a part of that narrative that they demonstrated with and protested with. And we, went and stood out and protested in front of senators' offices. and held up images of these catastrophes alongside written signs so that people could start to, that we were doing formation along with resistance. Well, resistance is formation, but I don't think that was in my mind at that time, if I'm honest. But at that time, we were starting to bring those things together so that more people could come alongside, so that there was something they could understand very clearly and say, okay, this is what climate change does. Whereas before, these are just words, and that they perhaps didn't think were words that were a part of their community. So I think for me and many of the young people that I walked with for years, that was a turning point. When the levees broke, it was a turning point.
Um, so I mean, I think I was part of a special commission for the just rebuilding of the Gulf Coast that NCC put together after Katrina and Rita. And so I was there. The first time I went was it was October of 2005, but it was the first day they opened the lower Ninth Ward.
Hmm.
And you went into the city and it was, I mean, it was like a ghost town. And we drove by Cassandra Carmichael, who now is the executive director of NRP, was on staff at NTC at the time. And we drove by a gas station. There was a boat at the gas station. You could see the lines of where the water had gone up. You could see the marks on people's doors of how many people they'd found dead there. It was, I mean, when I tell you it was life-changing, to see the impacts. So I think that was a pivotal moment. I think it was a pivotal moment for all of us because we saw people on roofs and we saw people, we saw the water, we saw people trying to make their way to safety and all the horrors the images that we saw there. I think, one of the myths I think about Black communities, I can speak, I think, a little bit for the community from which I come from, is that, there are other issues that seem to take precedence over environment. So whether it's food security or education, dealing with racial hatred, quite frankly, and other things. But one of the things that I would say we have always known is that plus B, that 1 plus 1 equals 2, that there are direct correlations when you have to boil your water, when you have to, when you can't really breathe, when, your nephew or your child or your grandchild has asthma, you got to keep running back and forth to the hospital for them to get care or for whatever kind of medical facility for which you can get care. This is not right, you know? And so I think there are more voices out there now, but I think there has always been some understanding that when these weather patterns happen and things are flooded and you can't get what you need you can't get to where you need to go and all those things, I think there has been an understanding that there's this connection, and that the disparities that exist only get exacerbated when a disaster comes. So whether it's COVID-19, or, hurricane season or fires, um, wildfires, or you name it. And so there are so many people who are like, we understand that this is connected.
That's right.
So people have this whole anti-woke thing, which I think if you're a Christian, you want to be woke. Jesus tells us to be woke, but that's another podcast. That's another podcast. But the idea that to say that our lives are interwoven together is somehow wrong or anti-Christian. I just hope that those listening will push back against those narratives, because not only are our lives interwoven, but God calls us to have interwoven lives with our neighbors. How about it? And that includes how we care for one another and the environment that we live in.
Hmm.
So I'll stop there.
Whew. Come on now, you're preaching. Yeah, that's literally what was coming to my mind as you were talking, and about how these climate events more and more, and even Hurricane Helene we're seeing, and even we're not talking about sort of these outer layers of these LA wildfires and things, but it really lays bare these issues, like these disparities, these things, these are already happening. But these events now are pulling the curtain back. It's apocalyptic. In that it sort of reveals, right? It uncovers what's really going on here, and I think that's really powerful. And it also made me think. I was just talking with someone just the other day about I think very similarly. So many, I think, if we're honest, and would say that, oh, like, I'm not racist, or I don't experience racism, or racism is not a thing. Meanwhile, like, we've just grown up, in my experience, like, totally 100% white church, and so, like, all these things. And so it's not that these layers aren't under there. It's that, well, actually, there's never been an event to push us into confronting what's behind the curtain, right? It doesn't mean there's not anything behind the curtain. It's just that we've never had to really deal with it.
And just real quick before Jenny, you turn it over to you. If you'll remember, I think it was 2023, the sky in New York turned orange. I don't know if you remember this, because of wildfires in Canada.
Yeah.
And orange, the sky was orange. And I grew up in New York. I have family there. Everybody, it was like, what in the world is going on? Now, I went to Syracuse, the orange. And so my sister was like, well, God prefers the orange, the Syracuse orange, but as a joke. But, I mean, the seriousness of what that means for how we're connected, and how borders don't really mean anything to a wildfire or to pollution. So yeah.
Jenny, I feel like you had something locked and loaded there.
Yeah, I do. I wanted to, for our listeners, to just put another point on the timeline, the history that we're talking about. Back a little bit further, back to the civil rights movement and the work of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Back in 1968, there was an event, the Memphis Sanitation Workers Strike, and that was a big event in terms of a public naming of environmental injustice, the conditions that the workers were working in, and having Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. bring voice to that and attention to that was really important, because the Black church was working in the civil rights movement and in that situation. And so I also want to name that the Black church has been working on this for a lot longer than the white church has been working on this. And I don't mean to totally bifurcate, but there's just a reality that, like, again, Monica was saying earlier about how the community knows already what to do. Like, y'all know how to take care of things when you're facing a challenge in a way that we don't even know the challenge of white folks. I'm a white woman. I didn't say that at the beginning, but we don't even always recognize the challenges that are happening to our neighbors. And so I think, connecting this to the civil rights movement is important. This work has been happening since then. The piece that was this called The Birth of the Environmental Justice Movement was in the 80s in North Carolina, Warren County, where companies were dumping poisonous chemicals into the ground in Black communities. And it was really dangerous and really unhealthy. And that started finally getting names. And it was the Black folks living in those communities that were naming it and saying, this isn't right. This isn't right. The church lending their voices. So those are really important pieces too. And then Katrina, yes. And then more recently, George Floyd and the increased book groups in churches talking about anti-racism. We're all in COVID and locking down and watching these images on TV, and more churches started saying, like, well, we actually do need to engage this, not just in our statements, but like, what does it mean to understand this in our churches and in our communities? Um, and I think we're in another moment now, in this administration where the racism that has been there is getting a new platform, a new megaphone, and it is just oppressive. That's not even an adequate word, but we're in this moment of oppression that is so public and so uh, blatant. And the day we're recording this, I'm like, when are we going to, when are we going to start doing even more or get up off out of our seats and name it over and over again and say, this isn't right. Not in our names.
Mm, yeah, that's really powerful. Yeah, I think, like you're saying, Leslie, is like I was thinking about, how, when water, when air, when all these things, are affected, we are all affected in these, and you sort of pull out. It's kind of like the pull out to space perspective, and you see how we're all sharing this. Ecological well-being is human well-being. All flourishing is flourishing for everyone, and then the reverse of that is true. And so, yeah, but then just, I was thinking about, maybe not everyone obviously who's listening is even familiar with these ideas but we live in a world where there are fences, and there are, we talk about, especially environmental racism conversations around fence line communities, and these sorts of conversations. And of course we could tell stories about Cancer Alley, and right in the Mississippi River, and that sort of 85-mile stretch between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. And I really appreciate that you brought that up, Jenny, because there is a long history here of Black communities, and especially faith communities, wrestling with this. And so, by no means should we say that this is a new conversation.
Well, I'm thinking of anytime we talk about this, and I certainly feel compelled to invoke the name of Verona Crane, my grandmother, who lived in a red line area, but and had come up from Mississippi, who had, of course, well, not of course, but was one who did work in the fields there. Both she and my grandfather. But when they migrated north, part of her um, cultural resistance to moving to the city away from her sisters and her brother and her family, for a better life, but still holding on to what of that life was valuable, was growing her own food. And so while she was in this, you know, kinda, I don't wanna call it an urban dead end, but certainly, I mean, you know how red line neighborhoods were, but while she was on 28th and Capitol in this, area, this just what l land she had behind the house, she planted food and grew food that nurtured me. And so what's interesting is while my father is the youngest of 7, and while they grew up with little, because there's 14 years between her oldest child and my father, what my grandparents could not give him, his siblings were adults. They made up for the difference. So I always tell him, you don't know any need because you were the last baby. You don't know what it is to have need. It really doesn't. And so here it is, he's this General Motors executive, and my mom is a teacher, and we're moved off into this upwardly mobile middle class Black neighborhood, quite a distance from my grandparents' home. But every day my grandmother was our caregiver. We didn't go to the daycare. So it was still that history and that culture that was nurturing me. I was eating from her table, which was still in this urban ghetto, a farm to table, just her little farm to table environment, which we don't know. Well, yes, we do. What that did for my health and my immunity and my strength and my intelligence and all the things, because I was eating fresh collards and fresh tomatoes and fresh potatoes and fresh beans and all those and okra and all those things that grandmama was making um and pulling from her backyard. And so it was that they didn't have that in my neighborhood. I can tell you right there, and certainly my mother didn't have the time and capacity to do that at the time with 3 young children and being a teacher. But at the same time, I'm thinking about and wondering, I wish I could go back, I wish I could go back and talk to her and ask questions, but like I wonder like what, and it's in me now, but what was it that just compelled you to to plant the garden that first spring? When you said I got, like was it missing home? Was it missing my great aunts? Was it missing the land? Was it missing being the dirt? Was it missing fresh food? Like was it the price of food? But what was it that was calling you from the inside to reclaim or to maintain this part of who you are and what you came from to provide this fresh food for your family? And so I just think there's something salvific in for creation and for ourselves in growing as a mechanism to care for, to bring about some justice for creation and for ourselves at the intersection. But I'm just rambling, but I just wanted to invoke her name, and she is all every time we had this conversation, I'm thinking about my grandma.
I love that so much. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. You say Irene, is that right?
Verona.
Verona. Oh, okay.
That's Verona. Though she never traveled to Europe, but her name was Verona.
I love it. Yeah, wonderful. Well, so a little bit more a context of what kind of brought this group initially together is that so in 2004 there was a statement that was sort of adopted by the National Council of Churches called "God's Earth is Sacred," and so last year we had the 20-year anniversary of that, and so it's kind of like okay. There was a statement 20 years ago. Can we tell? And anyway, so actually, I thought, hey, maybe it's a good idea if I read just a snippet of the abridged statement, and then that can maybe help us springboard into more of sort of a theological response, ecclesial response, and the practice, of how some churches are responding, but. Okay, so I'm just going to read a snippet of the abridged statement. It says, "We believe that the created world is sacred, a revelation of God's power and gracious presence filling all things. As partner communions of the National Council of Churches, we lament the shattering of the splendid gifts of this web of life, the ways we ignore our responsibility for the well-being of all life, and the destruction of species and their habitats at a rate never known in human history. We are called to care for God's good earth in ways that sustain life on the planet, provide for the needs of all humankind, and increase justice. We acknowledge and lament that colonialism and racism have exacerbated the impacts of climate change and environmental injustices on minoritized people, and we recommit ourselves to working in solidarity against these systemic harms. Churches, as communities of God's people in the world, are called to exist as representatives of the one who creates, restores, and sustains. We are called to worship God with all our being and actions and to treat creation as sacred. We all must engage in ensuring a thriving future for all creation and cling to the true gospel for, quote, God so loved the cosmos, John 3:16, rejecting the false gospels of our day. So, yeah, it's a pretty good word, isn't it? Yeah, thoughts hearing that and again that last line, rejecting the false gospels of our day. That one's coming for us, isn't it?
For It's definitely coming for us. Yeah, I love this statement. I love the way the 2024 version just kind of like cuts some of the fat, but is still so meaty in its essence.
Mm.
I keep thinking, Monique, you were saying, talking about your grandmother. My grandparents were in South Carolina. my mom grew up in South Carolina, and there were 9 of them, and m most of them moved north. My oldest aunt, who's still alive, the matriarch of our family, she is still in South Carolina. But my uncle my uncles who were in Queens, they had gardens. They planted vegetables, tomatoes, cucumbers, um, collards, green beans, and would drop them off at my mom's, and she'd cook them. So I think there's something about that is so meaningful. Um, and now churches are planting gardens as part of the resistance, I think, and a part of a recognition of the importance of not only food, but it, I keep thinking in my head, Monique, from what you were saying, that the land has memory, right? Like that there's even when you plant the seeds and vegetables grow or whatever grows, but there's memory in the soil. And I think that's also true for what we're doing to God's creation when we're not being faithful stewards of it. I think is also true about how we treat one another and how racism plays out. That there's a way in which the land in which we live is also um, has memory of it, and it comes out in various ways. And I wonder if, as people of faith, as Christians in particular, if that is a call to us, right, to create memory that leads to flourishing and counters some of the, I'm just going to name it, evil that has happened. Not only, polluting the land um, is a violation of the land itself, as well as the people who are impacted by the pollution, right? And cancer and asthma and all the different ways that it impacts our bodies. But is there not a call to us to to be able to respond differently, even in how we work with and coexist with the land itself, that will hold a memory well beyond the time that we're here on this earth? I don't know. I think there might be something to that. And I feel like the land is probably like, my goodness, what is going on with these people? Do they not see? I mean, when you when you bury the seed and it comes up as a vegetable that you can eat, um, we're interacting with the land in that moment, right? And so how do we not? I mean, I guess is it just selfishness? Is it just that we become so self-involved that we are so careless and callous with even the land and the ways that the God's creation sustains us? I mean, maybe that's more question than answer, but I think these are questions that beg to be answered or at least reflected on, especially when the Lenten season. Maybe it's a good time to reflect a little bit on how we are going through the earth like toddlers having a tantrum and tearing everything up because we think it's just going to automatically reappear after we've destroyed it.
You talk about the memory of the land, and that connects me to one of the phrases that Caleb used in reading about the statement about how colonialism and racism increase the impact of environmental injustice on minoritized people. I mean, colonialism and memory are intertwined, and um, so I think colonialism has led to a world where people are so focused on what they're going to do, what they're going to get, or what they're going to fix. And it's all about right now, and we lose that memory. We lose the memory of the ancestors, the grandparents, the people who stewarded this whatever land we're talking about at any given moment and benefited from it and kept it thriving and kept their people thriving until white folks came in and said, all right, now I'm going to commodify this. And it's not anymore about the connection between who's here and the land that's here, but about what I can take and do with this land to to get more for me and my people, more than I need to thrive and survive. Um, and I think that's even, working for a mission agency. I mean, we have a colonial history in our ministry, and it's something that we are working against. Well, we're trying to work against all the time because there's something inherent when we are partnering with folks who have been colonized historically, but we're still the ones who are providing resources for change, and there's this relationship of accountability um, that isn't equal. And I think that happens in the environmental justice movement today too, where as white folks see these issues and genuinely would like to fix them, but don't begin with, well, what's the history? What's the racialized history of the situation or the problem that I'm trying to engage? What knowledge is there that I don't have, and what wisdom exists right now? And how like, is it my role even to come alongside, much less you know, what wisdom is there about what solutions need to happen and what's needed of me that I can't know without knowing the memories that are there.
I love how you talk about that. Not starting at the beginning is there's a loss there, and there's a loss of regard. There's a loss of knowledge. There's a loss of really even healthy forecasting as to what you can do. And I was sitting there thinking, just based on my social location currently, when somebody's trying to date, and it's like, well, I just want to come hang out. You want to hang out at my house, and we just started dating. No, you don't get to come to my house. I let I'll see you at the Starbucks, and then maybe next week I'll meet you for lunch, and then maybe we'll go to a movie, and then I need to get to a theater or a concert, and then maybe, after a few months you can come and have dinner at my house. But you don't get to just start at my house. And so I think that is you're right about this order of operations that I think it really is what makes the difference in how we come together in the intersections. Like, we have to pause to regard everything that's coming to the middle and know and learn we can't know it all, but like get as much insight as possible so that we don't show up assuming too much. We don't show up haughty. We show up humble, like in the posture of learning. I think that's really, I think I've never heard that about, but that is really crucial, Jenny. I just want to, yeah.
Well, and I just want to say, like, some of us white folks are real anxious and we hear there's a problem and we want to get in there. Okay, now I get the problem. And that is part of the journey too, because like we need justice now. And like there's all this work we have to do. And so we have to figure out how to both bring urgency and bring patience and listening and going at the pace of those with whom we're trying to build relationship and trust.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, let me put out this fire with this blindfold on. Um, yeah, yeah. There's so many things that were just said. There is memory in the soil. Can we have a
I
t-shirt?
would like that in a large black with white letters as well as in hoodie form. Thank you.
I'll be working on that.
Yes. Reverend Dr. Leslie Copeland-Tune, there is memory in the soil. I'll buy one. Oh, that's so good. You know what stood out when you said that is the Genesis 4 text of like, God's like, I heard your brother's blood crying out to me from the ground. Yeah, you sharing, Jenny, made me think, like, just a couple days ago, I had coffee with a friend, and he was telling me about a conversation he had with another friend who was basically, the short version was like, man, how can you stay Christian? Like, how can you stay Christian right now? Like, specifically, like seeing, knowing the story and how just really littered with colonialism and white supremacy and all of it is, and it can be. And of course, there's all sorts of conversation that can happen there. But I just thought that was a really authentic. Yeah, I just thought that was a really authentic question, and I wonder if it's a question a lot of people are wrestling with right now, looking at kind of the things we're talking about here. And I'm curious to what maybe how any of you might respond to that. I know that's like a but thinking about people here. I mean, let's be honest, we as representatives of the church in our own corners and things, like what do we say? Like how is hope embodied here, and maybe even if you wanted to share like how you've seen some congregations in your own communions working in this intersection.
I will. I guess I'll jump in. So I've been asked that question for years because of racism and the role that the church has played in racism, in slavery and the slave trade, um, and all of those things. And my answer is probably the same then as it is now, which is Jesus isn't the problem, it's the people who are the problem. Jesus, for me, is the answer, right? And I think what I've been trying to do is have a more faithful witness. I think there's a level of truth telling and calling into accountability those who are within our networks and our families and our churches. Is a role of calling people to accountability. I believe in the remnants also, that there's a core group of us who will not bow to Caesar, so to speak, and will stand up for justice and for righteousness. And so that's where I'm hanging my hat. I'm praying and fasting, and I think this is a really tough season. I I think part of the hard part of it is that we see in so many ways in new ways, because it's not that our faith has never been hijacked. It's just this new version of hijacking. I'll name it as white Christian nationalism. Um, Although maybe not just white, because there are people in different communities who have embraced this idea of nationalism, of Christian nationalism, that looks and the Jesus that they talk about. I mean, I don't even know if they're actually talking about Jesus because um, what they're doing and what they're saying is just so far from the Jesus that I know, that I've learned about, that I think I could say the four of us know. Um, Jesus was empathetic. I hear there's like this whole movement against empathy. Like without empathy, we are not saved. Like because God so loved the world, right? So loved the cosmos that he gave his only begotten. That was empathy, right? So this harshness, this meanness, this cruelty that is out here, unleashed in ways that are just unimaginable, is just so unlike Jesus, right? So I think for us, part of our assignment is to lift up the Jesus that we know, who we follow, the Jesus who we believe is the Son of God, who came that we might have life and have it more abundantly, and that includes taking care of God's creation. That's a mandate, right? That we can't just do whatever we want. God gave us salvation and dominion with some expectations that we would care for it and grow it, the talents, right? That we would make better. And I think some of this is deeply theological, right? Like this whole scarcity business. Our theology says that there's more than enough, that God has a cattle on 1,000 hills, right? That the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, that there is no want in God, right? And yet we go and we act like if you get something, then I can't get it. And it is a lie from the pit of hell. I'm just going to say that. And I think for us, part of that is our assignment in this moment, how it impacts the earth, how it impacts our people, how it impacts our lives, how it's impacting our future. part of our assignment is to be the ones to help to steward it and to call others into that space, which is why you have churches, again, doing gardens, not only recycling, but finding different ways of composting, what we heard about in October. Some churches that are doing that, churches that are finding ways to whether it's light bulbs or solar panels, finding different ways to maintain and try to sustain the same sustainability ways whether it's in their church or their community, and even branching out even further. And so I think that God is continually and pushing us. Um, and some people they may lag behind, but that doesn't mean we stop. We got to keep moving forward.
That's a good word, and I think that the gospel inherently, like you're saying, like brings together creation and racial repair, and it's like if those things aren't present, maybe we're really not getting the full picture of the gospel.
Yeah. Just want to build on that question of why be Christian in this moment. And I think for me, it connects a little bit with the conversation we were having before about ancestors. Just knowing like I'm participating in one moment in a much bigger story. I didn't create these problems. I am in a position where I've gotten to benefit from, you know, injustice, environmental injustice. And I've benefited from the destruction of the environment, or I've thought I had benefited with the values had been taught. And I know I can't fix it all myself. These are much bigger than me, but I have a role to play. God calls me to a particular thing or things that I need to be a part of. And then those ahead of me are going to pick up the work and carry it on after I'm here. And I'm not going to see that promised land, but I trust that it is there, and by God's grace, we will get there. Right? How can you do it how can you get through these existential lifelong problems without knowing the people are going to pick up the work after you and that people were there before you?
I wonder if we could turn the page into, talking about maybe how you see the role of younger generations, or Jenny, how you've seen churches engage in integrating Christian racial justice, or new movements, or Monique, maybe some of the things that come to the surface for you.
Well, we're having so our youth and young adult leader, she's coming. We're having it's the 50th meeting, but it's been 51 years, but we didn't have one because of the pandemic. But it's the annual Black Ministers Retreat of the Christian Church. So it's been happening for half a century, and came about in response to the National Christian Missionary Convention, which is where the Black disciples merging with the International Convention to form the denomination that we know now in the 60s. But so the retreat came as a point of care and concern in response to merging. And so Green Chalice, our creation care ministry, is co-hosting this for the first time and participating. So we're bringing Dr. Heber Brown, to come in and educate our ministers on the Black Church Food Security Network. And then he's going to be doing that on Wednesday, but on Tuesday, but on Tuesday, he's going to be meeting with some creation care folk, both white and Black, who to talk about how land is more a part of our work and how it can be used as more a part of their creation justice work. And if they have land they can use, and just bringing these worlds together. And so our youth and young adult minister, who really fairly new to the work, has not really centered those things in their correspondence with youth and young adult. I mean, they're certainly talking about justice, certainly talking about intersectional justice, but the main things that have been coming to that conversation for youth and young adults, of course, has been um, queer affirmation and racial justice. Those have been the major things that have been coming to that intersection. So As a part of her work, she's now coming to spend the day ahead, the pre-conference time with Green Chalice, to learn how to integrate those things into the conversation the conversation she's having with youth and young adults. I do believe, as it relates to the Zillennials and Gen A, that it's not a leap for them. So I think if they're not already in the conversation, they're ready and open to it. It's just a matter of coming in contact with it. I will say too, there is a challenge that's happening alongside that, a societal challenge as it relates to inflation and the cost of food and the cost of more responsible choices has gone up where they have less income. So which can lead to also mental health crises and depressive episodes when you want to make the more responsible choice and then you don't have the resources to do that. So then you're forced into making the irresponsible, the creation choice to survive. You're going to the big box retailer, and that tension impacts the spirit and the faith of young people. These are things that inform for Zillennials and Gen A and probably younger millennials, inform faith crises. Whereas, like, if I want to do the right thing, but I can't even afford to do the right thing, why do I even try? Why do I even bother? Again, the intersection in the wellness piece in trying to bring people along has to also include do the best you can. Do what you can and what you can't do. And when you can do more, do more. So I think we have to make sure that we fleece from the conversation or sometimes from these narratives any residue or sprinkling of self-righteousness that can come or this haughty piety that can come when we're talking about things that we know about and have the privilege and access to know about and have the means to make strides toward, but it's not lost on me how much it costs, like to try to walk this narrow way. It's narrow. And when we talk about the narrow way and we sing these old hymns of the church and stuff like that, we out here we're thinking about, you know, sex and drinking and all that. No, 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 no. The narrow way there's a different definition of the narrow way right now. The narrow way is trying not to harm my neighbor,
Mm,
which is creation.
mm.
And so we've got to work on how we're communicating, so that people, when they decide, I do want to turn toward this path. I do want to love my sibling that is the earth. Um, how do I do that and I don't have a living wage? So like all these things are intersecting in ways that, and like I said, the timing of all this is just there's just real sensitivity, like and pastoral care that I think comes along with justice making. And sometimes those of us that have been in the movement, myself being one, I've grown from this. But when I think back to my early days in movement work, mercy, I score very low in the area of mercy. That's the whole truth. That's in writing. And so over time, my pastoral acumen has grown alongside justice making, and age, and wisdom, but I think it can be missed sometimes in our activism.
Yeah. I think that's a good word too, specifically for this conversation, is that, if I'm feeling just attacked here, which, that's kind of the prophet and priest dance of having these conversations with our people. Like, yeah, you are maybe participating in some villainous things, but like, let's just, like, all hypocrites, raise your hands in the air, and so, yeah, we're not saying you're evil, but like there are evil systems, and and it's important that we recognize our parts in that. Jenny, did you want to piggyback on any of that or anything that practically that the UMC and programs that you guys are doing?
Yeah, well, one thing that's going on in the West, I'm from the Seattle area, the Pacific Northwest, and the western region of the United States has some programming together as United Methodist. And there is a lot of discernment happening right now around the land back movement, which is a movement to return land to indigenous people. And the United Methodist Church is in a season of decline and churches are closing. And so in the Western jurisdiction, they're doing discernment about what it looks like to return land to the traditional stewards. When a church closes, what's going to happen to the property? One of the potential things, besides selling it or redeveloping it, is to give that land back to the people who originally stewarded it, if they want it. Um, and so the reality is, when a church closes, often there are people who have real feelings about it. There are people who say, "Well, we need to make much money as we can from this sale, so we can do other ministry, do mission in the world." But now there are more voices saying, or maybe we need to think about our history and our role in the history of land being taken away. This land not having been ours until we stole it or our ancestors stole it. And so, I don't have like a specific story I can share at this moment, except to say these conversations are happening as decisions are being made around what to do with church property.
Can I just add NRPE, over the past few years, we've been working with public lands to have some designated as national monuments and national parks. The most recent being Springfield, Illinois, where in 1908 there were race riots that ended up launching the NAACP. And so that was designated just in October of no, I'm sorry, August. It was August of last year. And there are other places like the Rosenwald schools that were and throughout the South to educate Black students, and just other places. So the idea being that not only is Black history American history, but that these lands and these monuments, these places, these locations have story that's important for us to know in a historical context. Another interesting, um, yeah. So I'll leave it there. But there's a lot, going on to make those connections as well.
Yeah, and I know we've all kind of mentioned kind of our current, like, we're recording this in March 2025 and all the things. And I think that does bring in, there's a lot happening politically. There's a lot, I feel like it's like shotgun fire, rapid fire, and lots of things at once. Yeah, obviously that can feel very overwhelming. Yeah, I think just thinking about the significant impacts of this intersection, I wonder, yeah, what's coming to your mind there? I know we've got a few minutes left, maybe, but in thinking about what's the most important or what's the most urgent feeling for you in this work, and if there could be such a thing, because obviously it's all connected.
I think for me, I have a very pressing concern about the health, what's happening with the earth, what's happening with chemicals in food and in the air, and how it's impacting the people who actually will have to still care for the earth. I mean, so there is for me, I don't, and I'm okay admitting this because everyone doesn't have to agree with it. But for me, I, I I do scaffold in my mind a priority as it relates to surviving. And so for me, when I think, okay, like we have to engage the work of creation care and creation justice so that we might survive. And I don't feel bad about saying that. So, um, that and 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 we are least likely, our my community is least likely to survive the worst that the environment gets. Even just recently finding out, what's happening with even like, hair products, and just like just the presence of harmful things all around us. Um like we have to become more attuned to these things so that, we might survive and our generations might survive, and so that we can also care for creation. It is, and it's for me, it's a walking back to center as it relates to our community. I always talk about like as a reclamation effort, it's a reclamation, it's a healing process. So if we started with a love and a deep affinity and knowledge of and marriage to earth, and it was a part of our very survival, and then our survival was threatened by abuse of us by way of the earth and the earth, like then I'm let's walk it back. So like let's deal with our survival so that we can then go return back to this marriage, that has been assaulted by by this society, and so by this racist society, and let's redirect. I think I'm at this place where how much energy do you take the energy that has been used to try to get folk to value you, reclaim that energy and put that energy into your very, very survival, the things that bring wellness to your life. Um, and that is fresh air, that is green space, that is fresh food, that is clean water, that is energy efficiency and all these things. Like, so that I'm talking about like there's a stewardship of energy piece, a stewardship of thought and energy and time that we have to free up some space because we have a lot going on in here as it relates to just our daily survival in a dominant culture that is um, um, steeped in white supremacy culture. So then how do we free up some of that space so that we can take on some of this? And I think part of that is saying, you know what,
Mm.
if your thoughts are raggedy about me and those who look like me, that's your loss. That's your loss. Go on about your raggedy business. And I'm going to go over here and build me a life. I'm going to go over here and build me a reality. I'm going to go over here and build me an intentional community of people who see God in every face. And you go on about your raggedy business and free up some energy with that. So that's where I am today, because there's so many things competing for our headspace and so many things competing for, and it's such a prized space that it has to center wellness in ways that it has not previously.
That's a really good word. Leslie, any thoughts on any of that, or the time that we're in right now? And
Yeah, I thought you were going to throw that to Jenny. uh, so I honestly, I hadn't articulated it the way that Monique just has, but I am being very careful about how I spend my time. I and my energy and my focus. I remember from 2017, January 20th, 2017 until January 20th, 2021. There was a point where my blood pressure, which tends to be on the low side, just because I'm a pescatarian, like I'm careful about, you know, salt and all those things. And so my blood pressure is always pretty, it's normal to low, but not dangerously low. But it was spiking high. And it was, one crisis after another. And so I'm just not willing to do that this time. I'm just not, I do feel like I'm so glad, Monique, you named you know, that we want to engage with each other with some grace, right? Um, for me in this moment, that grace is having to be filtered through a lot of prayer and fasting. I have had to negotiate and navigate and pray about anger and rage, because literally people are dying around the world, from decisions that are being made. Um, and it's just unnecessarily cruel, which for me is heartbreaking. Like there have been moments, I've woken up in tears just thinking about how children, how seniors, people who are sick are just being impacted by some of what we see happening. And so I'm trying to do my part and be mindful to do my part. My church did a 40-day fast, and a friend of mine has called us into fasting and praying the first 100 days of the new administration. And so I have been trying to be diligent about that, to see even people I disagree with as God's own children, and to see them as people who I disagree with, but nonetheless they're still people. And I think that's a discipline that we need to engage in in this moment. And I think we resist where we can, right? And I have children who are young adults, and this is a really tough time for them. I mean, you know, they are politically aware and engaged. They are, doing all kinds of things in their world. They work in DC and in political spaces. And so, our regular conversation is about self-care, is about how there is hope, that God is not through, that God is not finished, that we have to, we don't have, Jenny, I think you said, like, we don't have the answers to everything, but we can do something where we are. We can influence somebody where we are. And I think you do that in love, but in telling people that, in making sure we're telling the truth. Like we gotta, I know that there's a strain of thinking that has driven some of this anti-DEI, well, let me say the words, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like how you could be against that is kind of strange, but this is where we are. And I think some of it is because people have had a hard time understanding and negotiating guilt and what their role is and you know, which it's, it really is turning it kind of, it it's an inverse reaction to say, well, because I feel guilty, nobody gets to talk about this. That no, we don't get to fix anything because I'm feeling guilty about it is a very strange narcissistic reaction. But instead, I think what God calls us to is to repair breaches, right? Is to reconcile with one another, with the earth, with creation, and to, in fact, to be quick to reconcile, not slow, but quick to reconcile. And so I think in this moment, if we can remember to do our part, to influence where we can influence, to, NRP had there's an article about it, had a grant to where churches in 7 cities, urban areas were going to plant trees, and the funding got frozen for this. So, okay, we can't do it on that scale, but are there ways that that kind of ministry can still happen? Can we still care for our neighbors in some other way? If we can't do one thing, how do we pivot and do another? And I just think, you know, um, monitoring the news, checking facts. I mean, my goodness, check the fact because those algorithms are really manipulative, like even when I'm reading everything that I agree with, I'm like, let me double check because this could just be, something I want to embrace and it could be
Yeah.
far from the truth or far from what happened. And I have found there have been times when I'm like, "Oh, wow, I was being led down a total wrong path here. And so I think we need to be mindful of those things
Yeah.
as well. And community, like we need to be in community with each other. We need to find spaces to be in community with one another and people who maybe don't have our exact background.
So good. I hope people are taking notes because things are said. That's so wonderful. And I hear so much there, flourishing within limits, humanizing, not objectifying, and there's so many of these threads that yeah, we can all agree on. And so much of this is about let's stop with the labels and just get to know one another. Like, who are the people? Where are the faces and the stories and the places? And there's so much good news. I think here. I really appreciate that word. Yeah, I know we're kind of at time here. I'm thankful for you all and this space. Maybe Monique, would you want to send us? I know I'm putting you on the spot here. Do you want to send us off with any sort of blessing, or just a go forth that you're feeling in your spirit right now?
Yes, yes, let's center ourselves. Let's center them. God, you are with us. God, you are in us. God, you are for our good and the good of all. God, you are in us. You are with us. You are for us and for the good of all. Help us to reclaim and to restore your intention, not our doctrines, not our religious agenda, not our human power, but your good and right intention, which is the thriving and the flourishing of all people. You did not call us to hate or destroy or commodify or exploit the world, but you love it, and we ought do the same. We don't have to complicate what you have made simple. Help us to find that which is your simple, good, and right intention in this work and in all work. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Much love, friends. I hope that this episode bears fruit through your life and your ministry. Remember, you can find this situation here on Substack, if that's a helpful platform for you to subscribe and just get these episodes right to your inbox without having to do anything. So I'll link that as well in the bottom. And hey, grace and peace, friends.